So welcome to the second plenary of this conference. This is a plenary session that is sponsored by the Journal of Development Studies and will be given by Jason Moore on civilizing projects in the Capitalocene. There might be a change in title, and I'll let Jason tell you his precise title in a minute. Before we go on to that, I wanted to just announce that there will be the annual general meeting of the DSA. This is for members of the DSA, and that's tomorrow at lunchtime. At this meeting, council elections will also be held. And just to say that nominations and bios of the people who have been nominated for council positions will be available on the website under the AGM tab from later on this afternoon. So you can go and check there and decide who you want to vote for. So just a few words about Jason Moore before I hand over to him. Jason Moore is an environmental historian and historical geographer working at Binghamton University. He leads the World Ecology Research Collective or Network, whose main purpose is really to encourage diverse and radical perspectives in relation to capitalism. A significant thread in his work relates to his questioning of the notion of the Anthropocene and the culpability of humanity in general for climate change. Instead, he lays the responsibility for such climate change on capital, emphasizing the notion of the Capitalocene to capture this. Jason has written a number of books, Capitalism in the Web of Life, and is well known for having edited a volume, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History, and the Crisis of Capitalism. He has received the Alice Hamilton Prize of the American Society for Environmental History, that was in 2003, and also the Byers and Bernstein Prize in Agrarian Change in 2011. Jason, do you want to come on? Hi, Jason. Sorry? Oh, he thinks he's going to start at 2:20, so I have to talk for another 6 minutes.
No, I'm here.
Oh, great. Thanks, Jason. Okay, Jason, I'll hand over to you then. Thank you.
So my turn to start? Yes? Or Alex, are you coming in?
Jason, you can start.
Oh, okay, I can start. I wasn't sure if there was, thank you. Sorry about that.
No,
Very good. All right, I have my notes right here. We're in business to go. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's such a pleasure to get to talk about what I see as one of the most dangerous concepts in the neoliberal ideological arsenal, the Anthropocene, and to start to make sense of it politically. Indeed, that's where I would like to begin. I'd like to begin with the notion that climate crises are moments of political possibility. This was the case long before capitalism, with the crisis of late antiquity in Western Rome, with the crisis of feudalism, both of which involved tremendous climate class conjunctures of epochal crisis, of popular revolt, and were followed by golden ages for the direct producers and reproducers. This was also true in the Little Ice Age, and its two starkest and most unfavorable moments, the long cold 17th century, which culminates with political revolt and instability, the English cutting the head off the king, and an army of what were then called communists, levelers and diggers outside of London. This was also true, of course, for the age of democratic revolutions, so-called the French and Haitian revolutions, Tupac Amaru's revolt in the 1780s, the Irish and the sort of proto-Spencean socialism in England. These were very, very punctuated moments, some of the coldest moments of the Little Ice Age itself, the coldest of the last 8,000 years. So from this perspective, we have to embrace the sense that unfavorable climate shifts have been, historically speaking, moments of political possibility and of epochal and developmental crisis for various modes of production. And yet, much of a promiscuously defined climate justice perspective embraces climate doomism. Joined by most critical scholars, I'm sorry to report, this perspective holds it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Given 2 millennia of conjoined climate class crises through which ruling classes have been destabilized, that pessimism has to be examined. I think part of the reason for that pessimism is the persistence of man and nature thinking embodied today in the Anthropocene. Of course, no civilization has engineered the end of the world for more people than capitalism. Development studies scholars understand this better than most after a century and a half century, especially of death squads, assassinations, shock doctrines, third world fascisms, and all-out US and European-backed counterinsurgency. To save the village, it became necessary to destroy it. Of course, that from a US major during the Tet Offensive in January 1968. This is the geohistorical basis for the quip. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Its ideological basis accepts the invention of the civilizing project, an ideological expression of the class project, and its man-nature cosmology, which was always more than an epistemological or cosmological claim. It was a practical guide to power, profit, and life. And with it, unfortunately, goes the acceptance of capitalism's essential resilience by most radicals today, indeed most critical scholars. That's not only a mistake, I would say, it's a political calculus. It's one that accepts climate doomism and its state of emergency rhetoric and politics, which itself is a hegemonic move by the world's ruling classes, especially those around the broadly defined Washington-Davos axis to engineer a post-capitalist transition. Climate doomism and emergency is also, as we know, a rhetoric and a politics that has always served the ruling classes and the political right. And it stems from a way of seeing, thinking, and acting on the world that is implicated in the unfolding planetary crisis, and one that rests on the mode of thought born of the rise of capitalism. Man against nature, emphatically capitalized, mediated as ever by the civilizers. Today, its chief intellectual expression is something called the Anthropocene. So let's be clear, there's nothing particularly intellectually new about the Anthropocene argument. The notion that humans are a geobiological force was part of the original Holocene formation over a century ago. So why all the fuss now? Surely not because social scientists and humanists have suddenly fallen in love with geological debates over golden spikes. At the outset, let's underline that geology is the natural science discipline most directly implicated in the history of imperialism and the drive to make webs of life legible to capital. Before that, before the rise of modern geology, it was prefigured by cartography. From the 16th century, these scientific procedures generated the global mapping and local surveying necessary to turn natural distinctness into economic equivalence, to borrow one of Marx's great lines. Imperial boundaries, property lines, sources of potential riches, the mapping sciences have always ranked among capitalism's pivotal means of mental production, as Marx and Engels put it. Through these scientific regimes, imperial geopower could be translated into abstract social nature, forms of life that could be cheapened and fed into the vortex of endless accumulation. The fact that so many critical intellectuals accept the Anthropocene and its bourgeois and imperial geography, that is, earth writing, is testimony to the sting ideological power of good science. These scientific regimes, fundamental to the means of mental production, were intimately tied, as we know, to the military, class, and ideological moments of capitalist formation after 1492. Thus, the development of bourgeois science. Marx calls it an abstractly material science. I'm not against science, but let's be clear about what bourgeois science does. And to be aware of the bourgeois naturalism that fused with this emergent logic of power, profit, and life after 1492. But for the most part, the human sciences are really quite uninterested in the debate over golden spikes, some of us more than others. That debate pertains to the geological Anthropocene. The human sciences, however, are interested in something different, the popular Anthropocene. The popular Anthropocene is a discourse surrounding the origins, development, and contemporary features of the climate crisis. The geological Anthropocene is focused on, well, golden spikes, on stratigraphy. The distinction, however, is blurred by its scientific practitioners who wish to eat their cake and have it too. Like many scientists who came before them, these Anthropocene scientists are all too happy to trade on their scientific expertise to pronounce the end of the world, usually an end caused by too many people not wise enough to follow the science. So consider Paul Crutzen. Early on in 2002, he wrote an essay for Nature, The Geology of Mankind, he called it. Crutzen asserted that the climate crisis is driven, well, by the steam engine and overpopulation. This is hardly unique to Crutzen. It is typical of environmentalist thought in general, which aims to suppress the class relations of capitalogenic, made by capitalogenic climate change, and blame machines and human nature and markets, etc., instead. And however one assesses other issues in play, Crutzen's combination of technological determinism and neo-Malthusianism renders his Anthropocene an objectively right-wing concept, a good science expression of the environmentalism of the rich. More on that in a moment. Crutzen's summary is not so different from many critical intellectuals, by the way. With a few exceptions, everyone sees the climate crisis as an expression of the eternal conflict between man and nature. For eco-socialists, capitalism appears as a subset of the generality man, which we now say is humanity, but I want to keep the older reckoning of it for a specific reason. That is, that it denotes a specific ruling idea, or what I've called a ruling abstraction, pivotal to bourgeois ideology across the centuries. Now, for liberal anthropocenists, man appears as technology, markets, population, race, growth, and other so-called trajectories after Stephan's work. For both tendencies, man is overwhelming the great forces of nature to lean on a classic anthropocenic statement. Well, why should this be a problem? Several reasons. First, because the generalities of man and nature are not innocent. They are geocultural inventions of the civilizing projects from the very beginning. Second, because the pretension to value neutrality is justified in terms of good science, again, in the emphatically upper case, and what Habermas once called the scientization of politics. It's a necessary condition for planetary managerialism. Remember that, we'll come back to it, whose civilizing project today drapes itself in the banal discourse of the environmentalism of the rich. Planetary stewardship, nature positive, following the science, which is very different from following scientists and learning from them, following the science. Third, from the standpoint of historical materialism, abstract man and abstract nature are irremediably one-sided bourgeois conceptions. They lead to bad history and bad politics. Historical materialism, how easily we forget, began with the critique of abstract man. This is Marx's point on Feuerbach, and abstractly material nature as well. Well, for a decade, I and others have argued that the Anthropocene is not merely incorrect. It is an ideological movement of neoliberal and imperial force. The Anthropocene is the intellectual expression of the environmentalism of the rich, to borrow from Peter de Verne. This environmentalism has served as a crucial node of the unipolar ultra-imperialist networks of strange bedfellows, those bourgeois and their cadres of the commanding heights of Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the Langley-Washington corridor, and of course, the Davos masters of the universe. None of this is entirely new. It is rebranded from Spaceship Earth and Limits to Growth environmentalism from the 1970s that responded to the socialist, working class, and third world challenge to American hegemony, especially from the mid-1960s onwards. We'll come back to that. Like Spaceship Earth, the Anthropocene and its cognates deployed good science to convert the messy and contentious politics of climate crisis into techno-scientific management problems. This is planetary management. The Anthropocene expresses something, well, akin to the oppressed unconscious of the imperial bourgeoisie. Think the World Economic Forum's Great Reset. You couldn't make it up if it were a caricature. Its ambition is to solve the climate crisis, that is, of the Great Reset and other programs. Its ambition is to solve the climate crisis through a new mode of production led by the super rich and administered by an internationalist green technocracy of bureaucrats and scientists. The popular Anthropocene and the broader eco-industrial complex of green parties, universities, government ministries, NGOs, and the foundations in which it's embedded is a textbook case of an anti-politics machine. My reference to developmentalism as an anti-politics machine is neither a one-off nor simply a gesture to this audience. I've been writing quite a bit about this in recent years. I want to make the historical point crystal clear. Truman's point for developmentalism and the American imperial matrix of good science was born at exactly the same time in 1949. There were some forerunners, which we'll get to. The latter, the scientific apparatus, crystallized through the 1949 establishment of the UN Scientific Conference on the Conservation and Utilization of Resources. Born out of the aggressive anti-communist turn of Roosevelt's wartime one-worldism, the Truman Doctrine, point for developmentalism, and the new face of good science fused into a new incarnation of the Civilizing project. This is a story of how American hegemony and its developmentalist project not only created, but relied upon good science. To paraphrase Paracelsus, it is a story of how American hegemony invented Spaceship Earth. For the architects of Pax Americana, Seltzer writes, the non-political reputation of science was a critical political resource. Science became a three-pronged weapon for waging the moral equivalent of war. First, Seltzer writes, in man's endless struggle against nature, technical know-how tipped the balance in favor of humanity, which of course meant capitalism. Second, scientific truth was derived from the universal laws of nature and so transcended political ideology. We are back to the natural law of Locke and Malthus, amongst others. Finally, Seltzer writes, science revealed the unity and diversity of nature that made the interdependency of nations inevitable. Science, therefore, ought to guide the integration of global society, remaking its political geography to match nature's pattern of universal validity. Seltzer's book is quite spectacular on these questions of really outlining how good science was a pillar of American hegemony. And we know this from that American environmental imaginaries in the 60s were born out of the Cold War's anti-communism and Green Revolution. Its demographic imagination itself bankrolled as a new discipline by the Rockefellers and Fords. Yes, the same people who bankrolled the developmentalist project. So in this light, the Anthropocene is not merely a fashionable term. It's not merely some intellectual expression. It's a cultural formation. It provides a crucial means of manufacturing consent amongst intellectuals who are now convinced that the existential threat to humanity is so great that all questions of planetary socialism are off the table. It has become very much easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Climate emergency language, in this sense, appeals to a long-standing and quintessentially modern cosmology. It's not that there isn't a crisis, let me be clear, grasped as a biospheric and geohistorical transition in their entangled dialectical realities. There emphatically is, and it's emphatically very serious. It's that this crisis, this transition is understood first as a narrowly ecological crisis of man against nature that must be managed through new forms of technoscientific expertise and power. In question here is capitalism's environmental imaginary. Born in the bloodbath that was the rise of capitalism, this imaginary projects capitalism's death drive onto a novel cosmology, this quasi-eternal conflict between man and nature, very much still with us. We hear it whenever we encounter the language of anthropogenic climate change, as if the climate crisis resulted from humans behaving badly. In this self-interested scheme of man and nature, only enlightened civilizers, again the pedantic uppercase, only these enlightened civilizers can bring harmony and salvation. Whether through Christ, the civilizing mission, development, or the market, the civilizer's responsibility has always been the same. Civilize the savages, rationalize the irrational, develop the undeveloped, all so that catastrophe might be averted. Well, the Capitalocene, the age of capital, as a thesis, has become the most significant counter-narrative to the popular Anthropocene and its neoliberal rebranding of Pogo's lament. We have met the enemy and he is us. The mythic force of man and nature is not easily undermined. Its Cartesian, Lockean, and Malthusian lineages are all too easily forgotten or dismissed. And yet, like any idea that gains traction, the Capitalocene thesis has been widely misunderstood. Caricatures abound. The Capitalocene thesis is not, as sometimes suggested, a substitute for geological history. It is not an alternative to some geological periodization. The Capitalocene takes Earth system arguments about golden spikes as one of several necessary, emphatically necessary, points of departure. The Capitalocene is a geohistorical argument that unfolds through geological history, and in turn, as we know, produces that geological history. It is, moreover, not an argument for the primacy of economic motives, but a critique of economism, a point on which otherwise divergent Capitalocene theses agree. Finally, the Capitalocene in its world historical vista is a critique of Eurocentrism. It stresses the co-constitutive and uneven dynamics of cheap nature strategies in the rise of capitalism, its subsequent development on both sides of the Atlantic and later well beyond. This alternative underscores the centrality of imperialism and the civilizing project's oppressive dynamics is pivotal to capitalism's regimes of world accumulation, planetary life, and the worldwide class struggle. Well, of course, I can't unpack the whole story of the exhaustion of cheap nature. I've done that elsewhere, and I'm happy to dig into it. But I think that we're at the end of the road of cheap nature. That means the end of the road for capitalism's capacity to solve its overaccumulation crises, because not just of the enclosure of terrestrial aquatic frontiers, but because of the enclosure of the atmospheric commons and the great implosion, the epical reversal of the web of life from a source of productivity maximizing strategies, of cost reducing strategies, to productivity suppressing and cost maximizing strategies. This is leading to a set of ultra imperialist and political accumulation strategies in the present crisis. I'll try to come back to that in the conclusion. So in this story of capitalism that I'm telling, not as a narrowly economic system, but as a way of organizing the web of life, that is, as a world ecology premised on endless accumulation and endless conquest, it brings into focus something important. At its heart is the murderous cocktail of big capital, big empires, and big science, including the ideologies of the civilizing project. From that epical trinity of big capital, empire, and science emerged a mode of production that transformed the webs of life into profit-making opportunities. Well, of modernity's illusions, none is so powerful and none more fundamental to the imperial bourgeoisie's belief structures than man and nature. I know this is going to be tiresome by this point, but I can't overemphasize it. We are encountering, in trying to unthink these meta categories, which is, it's far more than an epistemological question. It relates to, think of Althusser's ideological unconscious, Bourdieu's habitus, these micro foundations of ideology that seep into our intellectual DNA, in fact, rewire our brains even. We know this from advertising studies and neuroplasticity, to think in terms of nature plus society, man versus nature. But we need to unthink these, and we need to come to terms with the ideology of the civilizing project that normalizes all of this and telling us how capitalism is the most rational and scientific mode of production ever created. Well, whenever new empires discovered new lands with new peoples who lacked sufficient military power to resist, the first act was always the same: declare the inhabitants as savage, unchristian, uncivilized, undeveloped. The new peoples were part of nature, not human or not quite human or not yet human. Savage in this way of thinking meant unruly as well as lazy, an ideological move that naturally justified work as the road to salvation. Again and again, good science affirmed the natural inequality between rich and poor, imperialist and colonized, white and black, man and woman, indeed inventing those categories in the process. Now, declaring something as a result of natural law, invariably through the binary of man and nature, which cleanses the process of class, as we can imagine, has been, this cleansing has been the essence of bourgeois naturalism. And far from a relic of the past, it's with us still. When Larry Summers, former US Treasury Secretary, says, the laws of economics work like the laws of engineering, one set works everywhere, he's giving us a taste of the ideological power of bourgeois naturalism. And what this environmental imaginary in the early modern centuries and redeveloped and redefined ever since did was to create out of civilization and nature, or society and nature, what I call ruling abstractions. That is concepts that not only ideologically describe the world, but inform a political project of the endless accumulation of capital. And this, I think, helps us to bring into focus the software, if you will, of capitalist modernity and class power. It's not simply about steam engines and pipelines. It's about the software, the means of mental production, as Marx and Engels say. And that's quite fundamental to put together these relations of the modes of thought and the modes of the mental and material means of production. So in short, blow up a pipeline and you could slow fossil fuels for a day. Revolutionize the relations of thought, capital, and technology that produce those pipelines, and you can stop excessive carbonization for good. Here, it's very useful to remind ourselves of an updated version of an old anarchist slogan: you can't blow up a socio-ecological relation. But can one manage those relations? Well, yes and no. And this is a vexing historical question and political question in relation to capitalism, but also in relation to many eco-socialist currents. The relations of the web of life flow through something I call the oikeos, the pulsing, creative, and multi-layered webs of life in which we all swim. These webs can be channeled, but never controlled. In the modern world, a capitalist world ecology of power, profit, and life, the dominant forces seek to fool us, and in so doing, they deceive themselves. This is planetary management. To discern some essence of these flows and webs, we need geohistory, literally an earth history that grasps the refusal of life to be managed and dominated in the interests of endless accumulation. Well, the mirror image of climate doomism today is capitalist Prometheanism, the fantasy that webs of life can be reduced to an uppercase N nature. That nature, that ruling abstraction nature, is far from innocent. It became a hammer of empire and capital, a ruling abstraction in the rise of capitalism. And we want to make sure that we grasp this ideological process that fuses the instrumentalities of nature with its ideological purposes in successive recompositions of world power, world hegemony, and world life and planetary life. And so these hegemonies justified two major processes, or were justified by, I should clarify, two major processes. One was the civilizing project. The new empire saw the civilizing of savage humans as amongst their greatest responsibilities. Through nature, civilizers enclosed the lives and labors of most human beings along with terrestrial frontiers. Importantly, nature became an imperial claim to the unpaid work and energy of, to quote Maria Mies, rest in power, women, nature, and colonies. A second element of the new ruling abstraction was the instrumentalization of civilization and nature into an imperial managerial philosophy. To borrow from Descartes, thinking things managed extended things, endowing the new bourgeoisie with an ethical responsibility. To quote Descartes, we must make ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. Henceforth, the world bourgeoisie would seek to manage the planet as if it were an electronics factory, a sugar plantation, an insurance office. Imperial managerialism, in turn, was intimately joined to the civilizing project, which finds a crucial ideological pillar in good science. That good science is, of course, a staple of mainstream environmentalism, the environmentalism of the rich. Extinction Rebellion instructs us to listen to the science. The great Naomi Klein, I don't say that facetiously at all, tells us to pursue science-based solutions. But good science, certainly from the era of Bacon and Descartes and the gendered counter-revolution of primitive accumulation in 17th century Europe, onwards through Malthus and neo-Malthusianisms, good science has never been a friend to the world's reproducing classes. It has always been a practical ideological tool and a crucial means of mental production. Climate and pandemic era invocations of good science are therefore hardly new. When Anne and Paul Ehrlich told us in 1968 that the problem was simple math, they were carrying this legacy into an era of world revolution. Too many people, in their view, were pressing against the Earth's carrying capacity. The taproot of the problem, well, billions of years of evolution. And people think I talk about the longue durée, forget about it. The Malthusians have me beat every day of the year. Populationism, long the scientific abode of policymakers and a growing academic establishment, became a unique blend of metaphysics after 1968, and the popular imagination becoming the cause of war, famine, pollution, inequality, and underpinning the Anthropocene worldview as well. Well, the Ehrlich's environmental neo-Malthusianism fits squarely within an ideological procedure that defined Cold War anti-communism and its post-war developmentalism. Habermas famously called it the scientization of politics, whereby capitalism's social contradictions were converted into managerial problems amenable to rational government. Good science became a pillar of American world hegemony and its civilizing project, Truman's point forward developmentalism, and its imperial scientism. Now, of course, the Ehrlichs were not alone. An alternative title to their book was Our Spaceship is Bursting. And I think it's crucial to understand that the Anthropocene is very much a repackaged Spaceship Earth environmentalism. But not many people know this history because there's a kind of flight from history that goes on in a lot of these academic vogues, especially over the past 2 decades. So like Spaceship Earth, today's popular Anthropocene is not only a metaphor for the world's problems, but an anti-politics machine and prescription for techno-scientific authoritarianism. Indeed, both green super metaphors, Anthropocene and Spaceship Earth, were readily taken up by significant ruling class intellectuals, and both figure prominently in respective eras of the environmentalism of the rich. For those of you who don't know, Spaceship Earth was a term coined by the quirky architect and designer R. Buckminster Bucky Fuller in the 1960s. But it was quickly seized upon by Cold War diplomats and intellectuals like Adlai Stevenson, who used the term in his last United Nations address just a couple of weeks before his death in 1965, It was also the subject of a book in 1965 by Barbara Ward, whose name will be familiar to many in this audience, an imperialist Labor Party intellectual who wrote about the sort of imaginaries of international cooperation in an era of imperial anti-communism. Can't we all get along? So Spaceship Earth was really a metaphor of world order, not the biosphere, although it quickly morphed into the latter. Indeed, Barbara Ward quickly, by 1972, definitively became the first organic intellectual of ruling class environmentalism with the Stockholm 1972 conference. And if you're curious about the impact of Spaceship Earth as a right-wing ideology, I encourage you all to go to YouTube and look at a 60-minute video called The Survival of Spaceship Earth. And your jaw will drop after the first 2 or 3 minutes. It is the most relentlessly neo-Malthusian video that I have ever seen. And so while this era is often associated with a kind of social movement environmentalism, which, by the way, I don't think was much of a social movement, but we can get into that. That second wave environmentalism was also linked to a movement of planetary managerialism. And I want to mostly focus on that while laying out the connective tissues that both shared as a form of what Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberalism. But I want to focus on the crisis of the 1970s as fundamentally impacting our thinking today as we head into the last chunk of this talk. Sometime in the early 1970s, imperial bourgeoisies and their intellectuals started to freak out because of unprecedented challenges from the New Left, from third world nationalisms, from socialists, and all the rest. And not least, as I and others have written about, the commodity price boom of the period 1972 to 1975. I don't think we can conceive environmentalist notions of scarcity without that bit of economic history. But in any event, what we saw in this moment was the effort to forge what Kautsky had called an ultra-imperialist condominium. And its chief institutional form was the Trilateralist Commission. For those who are curious, Stephen Gill has written the classic text on this, and I've written a fair bit about this across several essays. Richard Gardner, the trilateralist diplomat, just a couple of years after The Limits to Growth was published in 1972, said the quiet part out loud. Writing in Foreign Affairs, he wrote, "While we won't see world government in the old-fashioned sense, key elements of planetary planning and planetary management will be necessary as we move forward, especially around strategic resources." This was formally the Trilateralist Commission's position, but it was embraced by other nodes of an emergent transnational capitalist class. And it's crucial that we come to grips with the contradictions and the kind of vast contradictory, inchoate at times, consciousness of this transnational capitalist class, really around what I'll call a Washington Davos axis, if we want to make sense of the environmentalism of the rich. But to understand that moment, we have to understand the roots of today's environmental imaginary in the permanent war economy and the mobilization for total war that occurred during World War II and that led to the cybernetics craze, as James Baldwin put it, in the 40s and 50s. It's from that cybernetics craze and its planetary managerialism that we saw the emergence of a triple orientation on the part of the world's ruling classes in the imperialist countries. This triple orientation was the management of war, the management of labor, and the management of planetary life. And in the first phase, those possibilities were mobilized in pursuit of American world power and workplace control, the dream of the automated battlefield, to quote General Westmoreland from Vietnam, and the robot factory. But planetary life was to be managed as well. And I think that we can see that incubating within the scientific and soft power infrastructures of the Green Revolution, which I don't need to lecture all of you about. So to put perhaps too fine a point on the matter, the same forces behind American developmentalism created the policy, academic, and institutional matrix of modern environmentalism, not least by financing new disciplines like demography, area studies, and by the end of the 60s, environmental studies. So the cybernetics craze had grown out of these logistic and operational demands, but of total war, of the Truman Doctrine, of counterinsurgency, and then total war again in Vietnam and elsewhere, in this era of profound crisis. And there's a longer story that I can't really get into, but what I want to point out is that the cybernetics limits to growth modeling that comes to fame in 1972 with Donella Meadows and her crew, that modeling was developed at the Sloan School of Management at MIT, so at a management school by a fellow named Jay Forrester, who really is a fascinating figure and developed a lot of the key elements of the computing infrastructure in support of the American military's first strike nuclear planning. So the doomsday imaginary of modern environmentalism connects rather directly to the doomsday strategizing of the American empire during the Cold War. Of course, limits to growth was financed by the big foundations, Fiat, Volkswagen, Ford indirectly. And Dennis Meadows said the quiet part out loud in 1973, talking to the BBC's documentarians. He said, "We're talking about a system," Meadows told the documentarian, "in which various balances between material output and population can be engineered more or less to suit the particular objectives of a society." So what we want to be doing is not to dismiss key useful insights and elements of this environmentalism of the rich. We want to begin to interrogate in Bourdieu's reflexive or Gramscian critique of ideology, the real connective threads between the intellectual life and the ideological processes of capitalism and the ways in which these are unfolding in the present moment. So what I would say bluntly is that the popular Anthropocene is biospheric Taylorism after F.W. Taylor, the founder of scientific management. Scientific management itself was derivative of forest and natural resource management in the 19th century, which itself drew on earlier European and imperial strategies of botanical imperialism and all the rest. So we want to have a sense that when we talk about the Anthropocene, we are talking about the boss's view of the web of life. And basically what I want to foreground just in closing this out is that what limits to growth represented was a kind of planetary management, ultra-imperialist fantasy of the trilateralists, which that alignment is still, at least for now, very much in motion of the Japanese, North American, and European bourgeoisies are very much in alignment against a world that is very much, let's be polite, in open question of those unipolar ambitions. And so we are at a moment where we need to confront the environmentalism of the rich and the popular Anthropocene imaginary as fundamental intellectual questions. We can no longer simply invoke in the Anthropocene as if this is a secondary issue. And we need to highlight what Richard Falk, Richard Falk, called in the early 1970s the trilateralist limits to growth perspective as a geoeconomic search for a managerial formula that will keep its concentrations of wealth intact. That was pretty far-sighted. And so to close this out just in the next couple of minutes, because I want to stick on time so we have lots of time for good discussion, is that we really begin to reflect on how does the left, broadly conceived, move from seeking to be a rational planetary manager to being a comrade with webs of life as a whole. And that latter possibility, I think, is suggested by Marx when he repeatedly refers to humans as defined by the ensemble of relations themselves, the products of a labor metabolism. To paraphrase Engels, man makes himself through labor. That, of course, would later be the title of a Child's wonderful classic of Marxist archaeology. And for this, it means that we engage the intellectual dynamics of the academy as inextricably rooted in the realignment of the intelligentsia under neoliberal conditions, and the ways in which we have been disciplined in order to produce acceptable knowledgers for hiring, for funding, for all the rest. Well, this is why the Capitalocene is such a dangerous idea, because it offers unacceptable ideas, dangerous ideas. And even people like Greta Thunberg, who is really a well-behaved and rather conventional environmentalist, now sort of flirts on the edges with anti-capitalist critique. Of course, she has to qualify, well, consumer capitalism problem. What I would flag, though, is less Thunberg, who I see as problematic, but a significant generational shift across the imperialist countries, as well as across the world, willing to talk openly now about capitalism and socialism. This discourse is still underdeveloped, and there are many, many fragments out there. So I think it's dangerous to be doctrinaire, as I see many of my comrades on the socialist left do. We want to assemble a rich totality of many determinations in foregrounding this question of capitalism and socialism in the web of life. We need to recognize that we are at a conjuncture, a new transitional moment greater than any since the first agricultural revolution at the dawn of the Holocene. And I want to borrow from the great Samir Amin here. Will the transition be what he called decadent, with the 1% re-engineering planetary life in service to a new hierarchical and exploitative but non-capitalist civilization? Or will it be a revolutionary transition, one in which the associated producers and reproducers seize the means of mental and material production and reinvent these on the road to planetary socialism? The answer is, of course, up for grabs at this point. But the revolutionary path will remain utopian so long as we continue to indulge the ahistorical and liberal modes of thinking of man, nature, and civilization that enabled the capitalogenic climate crisis. Without a return to world history especially, that's not a magic bullet, but it's a key missing link in these discussions. Without a return to world history, struggles for planetary justice will remain fragmented and divided, our solutions stained by bourgeois and professional managerial virtue signaling, decoy politics, and managerialism. It is to these dangers that the Capitalocene thesis speaks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. That's given us a lot to think about. I will ask Neha to come up and say a few words. I think she hasn't had a lot of time to prepare this, but Neha, if you start off the discussion, then the audience can carry it off. Just to say, to introduce Neha, she is a lecturer in economics at the University of Reading and has agreed to discuss this session.
Thank you very much, Uma. Thank you, Jason, for this extremely thought-provoking plenary. Following on that talk to be the discussant isn't an easy job, but thank you for giving me the opportunity. So as Uma mentioned, Jason is an environmental historian, a historical geographer, a professor of sociology, and he deals with big questions on political economy and is extremely philosophic in his scholarship. So you can imagine the breadth and the depth of his scholarship. And, you know, as much as I feel that Jason would not like to be constrained in the disciplinary boundaries. And despite Jason's criticism to developmentalism, I would like to point out that this DSA conference here at the University of Reading has been exactly this amazing collective of interdisciplinary research. And Jason's work is an amazing representation of this rich scholarship. So I'm going to concentrate on some of my main takeaways from Jason's talk and general scholarship. And I appreciate that I'll be wiping out a lot of the nuances in his work in trying to sort of, summarize a lot of it in the next few minutes. But my first big takeaway was Jason's very important point that the oft-repeated statement that human society causes climate change is not just incorrect, but also extremely problematic. The claim that climate crisis is anthropogenic is something that Jason points out is rooted in the long and violent history of the Civilising project of big capital, big empire, and big science. The Civilising projects constitutes and normalizes profit-driven conquest, appropriation, and exploitation of humans and rest of nature to sustain endless accumulation of capital. The Civilising project's violence is violence to nature. That is what writer Amitabh Ghosh calls the nutmeg's curse. That is the story of the nutmeg, is the story of conquest and exploitation of colonies and nature. In the introduction to his work, Capitalism and the Web of Life, Ecology on Accumulation of Capital, Jason differentiates nature with capital N and nature with lowercase n. So uppercase N and lowercase n. Uppercase N nature is an outcome of capital, empire, and bourgeois science. It is external, controllable, and reducible. The lowercase n nature is nature as us, inside us and around us. Believing that climate crisis is human caused rather than capitalism caused is one of the ideological stances that bolsters the Civilising project. Capitalism relies on what nature calls the Prometheanism, domination and management of nature, racism and sexism, all bound together by the Civilising project to drive profitability. These are, to him, the three unpaid pillars of capitalism: women, colonies, and nature. I interpret this, sorry, I have lost my text, yes. I interpret this as a call for a more democratic solution to the crisis as we see it. How can we be comrades of webs of life? This was also a theme that resonated in the talk by Jay Mistry in the opening plenary of this conference. This brings me to my second takeaway from Jason's work. The problem of Anthropocene, or environmentalism of the rich. This to him is a cultural formation fueling right-wing neoliberalism. It is easier to imagine the end of world than the end of capitalism. Jason says it quite a few times in his work. The problem is with the dichotomy between society and nature, humanity versus nature. Conceptualizing society without nature and nature without society, to him, are the root cause of the problem. And this is the basis of modern world's violence, inequality, and oppression. The society-nature dualism is the core of the Anthropocene argument, which, while has its merits, also limits the understanding of climate crisis. Jason argues, or at least I interpret this as Jason's argument for a broader, more holistic understanding of the crisis of our times in the overlap of power, nature, and accumulation as they manifest in the present moment. And this is what I have understood of Jason's work, that we really have to embrace the messiness. We cannot rely on the binaries that big sciences use. And finally, one last thing, which wasn't sort of the topic of today's conversation, but something in Jason's work that really resonated with me was his argument that we need to reimagine history to imagine the future. Jason points out very eloquently in his broad scholarship the importance to reflect on what has occurred to aid in our understanding of what comes next. And from a personal experience, my first and second degree were in economics in universities in India. And I was always troubled by how ahistorical the nature of economic training was to me, a student, a brown student from the global South, a former British colony. It left out any acknowledgement of my grandmother's unpaid labor raising her family, the exploitation of her land, her natural resources under colonialism. But also, it also leaves out the kind of privileges that me, my parents, and my grandparents benefited from, including caste and class privileges that also formed a part of capitalism. Jason writes, I quote, "Among the imperial bourgeoisie's decisive ideological victories in recent decades has been the erasure of world history from radical imagination." So I would like to end with a couple of questions for Jason. The first one is a little bit, provoking, possibly. While I appreciate the claim that climate crisis is anthropogenic, is inaccurate and does give concession to capital-led profit accumulation, but can society and human be absolved of all responsibilities associated with climate change? That's my first question to Jason. And the second question is, what are our responsibilities as social scientists, as creators of knowledge, in ensuring that we find a democratic solution to the climate crisis? What you called, how can we be comrades of webs of life? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neha, for putting it really succinctly and leaving us with a couple of questions. Maybe I can ask Jason to address Neha's questions before I go to the audience.
Well, just very quickly, and I'm happy to elaborate more, this question of responsibility is hugely important. Saying that we all have a responsibility to do something is very different from identifying those responsible for the climate crisis. Those responsible for the climate crisis have names and addresses precisely like the slave trade and slavery, out of which the dynamics of the planetary inferno were dramatically amplified, because let's remember that slavery, the profits of slavery and the slave trade were critical in a purely economic history sense to the capital formation of the British Industrial Revolution, never mind the story of the cotton frontier and slavery and all of that. So they have names and addresses, and they need to be held to account. Now, the other dynamic, of course, is, do we have an ethical and moral responsibility to do something? Yes. Now, the responsibility of the intellectual, that's the other part, and that's fundamental. I would say the responsibility of the intellectual is to refuse to allow the knowledge factory to manufacture our consent, and to begin to do so by challenging the disciplinary structures and the whole structure of academic business as usual. I've noticed that we all, many of us, are gripped by this sense of the enormity, the severity of the climate crisis. That's my view. And I often say, if we believe the climate crisis to be as serious as it is, as we believe it to be, then we must act that way within the knowledge factories as well. That academia as usual is no more acceptable than business and politics as usual. And there are a lot of different elements, I think, and it's easy to pigeonhole somebody for giving a very partial response. But my insistence over the past decade has been that we must do, especially around man and nature, what radicals have always insisted, which is name the system. We must name the system and identify those responsible for the climate crisis, not merely as the overaccumulation of greenhouse gases, but as part of an overall capitalogenic trinity, what I've called the climate class divide, climate apartheid, and climate patriarchy. So I think we can begin with that.
Thank you. So if I can go to the audience, I think there are a couple of people with mics at the back. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'll go with the 4 in the middle, if you can bring the mic down. I'll just check that Jason can hear it. 160 here. All the way in the front, sorry. Yeah, this lady.
Hello. Hi, Jason. Do you hear me? Ali
Perfect.
Medadi, SOAS. Great lecture. Thank you. I want to just probe you a little bit more on the politics, which was also Neha's second point, I guess, because some of the theoretical tenets of your framework draw on ecofeminism and eco-socialism. And we just lost the great Maria Mies in the last month. So I think it's just perhaps also something we owe to her to discuss a little bit some of the political implications we derive from analysis like this. If we look at what the ecofeminist argument was, connecting these sort of webs of extraction with unpaid labor, so women, the colonies, the web of life, one of the sort of implications for Mies and others was the development of alternatives, and in her view was the subsistence perspective. Now, of course, they had very specific concerns, but it does resonate with, for instance, very contemporary calls for degrowth and what has been called by Stefania Barca and others as environmentalism from below. So I wonder when, we try to unpack some of the political alternatives, if you see any of this type of theoretical and political alternatives from below as something that you would consider to move from what you call the environmentalism of the rich from an environmentalism for all. Thank you.
It's a great question. So about degrowth, of course, degrowth is a mosaic and a spectrum. And I'm very sympathetic with anti-imperialists in that movement, like Jason Hickel and others who maintain a very strong anti-imperialist approach to the climate crisis. As you can imagine, I have problems when we start with a fetish. We're going to end with a fetish most of the time. So growth, of course, is a fetish. The problem of crisis is not growth, which is itself a fetish. That grow, as we know from reading Mitchell and many others, the growth is a fetish that emerges out of the imperialist project itself, and national accounting, deeply implicated in developmentalism after World War II. So that's a real problem. When we begin with a fetish, we're going to end with a fetish. And that's not to dismiss the very, very important work of a lot of left-wing degrowthers, which I respect and honor. Now, the question about ecofeminism is very interesting because we've sort of conflated, not like you've conflated in a negative sense, but there's a trajectory of people like Maria Mies, like Veronica Benholt-Thompson, towards a kind of peasantism. And that's problematic. That a retreat into subsistence is not a politics that will aid in the global class struggle against the climate dictatorship of Washington and Davos. Of course, and it won't inform the struggles to come. So we need a struggle for socialist transformation. It's all well and good to talk about seizing the means of reproduction, but if we don't have a class and anti-imperialist strategy for that, then for gaining state power and reorganizing social and socio-ecological relations, will go nowhere. So Maria Mies, it's very interesting that Maria Mies, may she rest in power, gets transformed into a kind of subsistence thinker as an ecofeminist, but really her classic work is a book about proletarianization and the relations of paid and unpaid work in the making of global capitalism, and specifically in the relations of surplus value extraction and world accumulation. And a lot of those elements are lifted out. You highlight Stefania Barca's work. She's wonderful. So I would separate her and make her distinguished from some of the peasantism that goes on there. Here's the thing, the ecofeminism and Marxist feminism sort of had elements of a synthesis that were necessarily incomplete. And Marxist feminism had a very difficult time with the web of life. Ecofeminists generally romanticize a kind of biologist female attachment to Mother Earth, which is a bit of a Stockholm syndrome kind of position, because the gendering of nature was part of the capitalist violence of primitive accumulation, as Carolyn Merchant and others have shown. So what we want to do is take those elements and put them together in a new synthesis. I would say world ecology is what allows us to put together class and gender and social reproduction with the accumulation of capital in the web of life. That world ecology sort of takes where both of those movements have stopped. And for some reason, there's a resistance to the kind of synthesis that we are enacting.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you very much. Yesterday in the plenary, I made a comment that we need more strategic thinking, and I think we got a great deal of that now. Terry Cannon from the Institute of Development Studies. What I'd like to do, Jason, is to take it more concretely, because the overview you've given is extremely rich. So I'll give you a concrete example that relates to IIED, International Institute for Environment and Development, which was started by Barbara Ward. Just last week, they announced a funding call for locally led adaptation projects relating to climate change in the global south. And this would be around £10 million in the first call, so it's nothing. But this project is called Restoring, let me see if I can get the actual name for it, is Reversing Environmental Degradation in Africa and Asia, with £10 million. And if you look at the funding through major banking corporations that destroys nature, it's thousands of times greater. So it's an arrogance and an extraordinary thing. I wanted to place this in one of a subset of what you've been talking about, which is the connivance of the North's climate change supposed obligations to the third world, global south, in terms of adapting to climate change, where there's very little money going. And the problem that actually this adaptation funding game, if you like, smooths over all of the problems of people's lives in the third world. I mean, Bangladesh, a country I'm reasonably familiar with, none of the problems of the people in Bangladesh are caused by climate change. None of the problems of the people in most countries are related to climate change yet. Of course, climate change will make their lives a lot worse. But the whole narrative around adaptation is enabling a kind of an alliance between global capitalism and Western governments to connive with governments of Bangladesh and others to pretend that this is about climate change, when basically none of the problems that the people suffer, poverty, vulnerability, and so on, ill health, have anything to do with climate change. And the problem is development studies will be participating in that, in enabling that process.
Well, you stated the matter perfectly. And, you know, to what can I add? Yes, of course, this is a textbook case of what I mean, that we have a kind of climate, industrial, academic complex that works to as you put it, do this climate adaptation that is very superficial. And on top of, 4 to 5 decades of austerity, I think that the plan of the Euro-American condominium is really to try to solve the climate crisis on the backs of the global South, a kind of green austerity program for everyone else. And what we're seeing now is the geopolitical unraveling of that, as we see a very sort of rough and ready global South China Belt and Road block against a Euro-American, Davis, Washington access. And we're going to see a lot of conflict. I think not just these ongoing proxy wars all around the world, but also I think the unraveling of the academic civil society foundation nexus that has kept a lid on a lot of the social volatility of the neoliberal world over the past few decades. So, but really, you stated the matter perfectly. I agree with every sentence.
Thank you. There are 2 more questions. Okay, these 2 in the middle, and then I'll move to the side in case anybody.
Thank you for a thought-provoking presentation, James. Fanny Fröhlich, School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies, University of Bristol. Thank you also, Neha, for the great summary and the eloquent inputs. And I really thought it was powerful from both the speech and the inputs, how it encouraged us to rethink or maybe to more unthink foundational concepts, approaches, and entire epistemological projects, which I think is very timely, very necessary, very important. My initial question links to what the first discussant asked and was around if you, James, could speak a bit more on what you think are the gendered implications of considering the Capitalocene. My area of expertise is gender and development, but I want to ask a follow-up question because I think you addressed that question quite well already. And this follow-up question is more broadly a critique of what I understood to be a systemic Marxist analysis that you've offered us. And then the a bit perhaps provoking question, which perhaps is an old question on systemic Marxist analyses, is where's the room for agency of people in planetary socialism? And what are perhaps also some of the risks and limitations of that planetary socialism that you have introduced, including perhaps particularly in terms of gender? Thank you.
Outstanding question. So the question of social reproduction and unpaid work and the ideological gendering of capitalism has been central to more or less everything I've done over the past decade. Now, neither the Marxist feminists nor the ecofeminists are having anything to do with it, which is a little bit mystifying. But I would say that my position is very much in dialogue with Silvia Federici's, which emphasizes the ways in which gender is invented as a ruling abstraction. That's my terms, out of bourgeois naturalism. So gender is not some pre-existing, modern gender binaries are not some pre-existing structure, but deliberately invented and enforced and policed both geoculturally and through law at this crucial moment of formation of capitalism, that is during the long cold 17th century between 1550 and 1700. So when I talk about the climate trinity, the capitalogenic climate trinity of the climate class divide, climate apartheid, and climate patriarchy, these were formed in the 17th century and are driving today's crises. I would argue against the reification, the mechanical reification of gender as some intersectional moment that's abstracted from class. With Federici, I would insist that gender is a terrain of the class struggle in which questions of superexploitation and socio-ecological ideology and transformation are all joined. So that's been absolutely central to my work. I thought I gave a talk about agency. It's just that it's the agency of the bourgeoisie that we have to explain if we want to understand the history of planetary managerialism. And in fact, as I've articulated, that this is always, including in the history of the world in Seven Chief Things, which is maybe the best example of this, but throughout, that these moments of what I call the long Malthusian cycle are directly in response to class struggles from below. I'm not sold on the concept of agency, which I find is a very kind of neoliberal descriptive concept for what we used to call class capacity or political power. But yes, absolutely, the dynamics of capitalism have brought us to this point where the conditions of possibilities for solidarity of the planetary proletariat, that is, of proletariat, semitariat, and biotariat, linking the domains of paid and unpaid work, of human and extra-human work, are greater than ever before. We have to have political clarity, however, around the program. It can't be small is beautiful. It can't be let's all go to farmers markets and buy organic. It has to be political, and it has to, in order to rise to the scale, to the challenge of the climate crisis, it has to take seriously the savings and investment mechanism of capitalism. So we have to have a strategy for that. Now, somebody asked concretely, I would say the most concrete struggle right now is the struggle against the escalation of war and the threat of nuclear war. And the struggle against especially America's global military presence with its 700 to 800 military bases and special forces operating in 3/4 of the world's countries, 1/3 of American foreign military interventions occurring since 1999. We need to put those front and center in all of these struggles. They have powerfully, of course, gendered dimensions in all cases. Thank you. It's a great question.
Thank you.
I don't know what Marxists always talk about agencies, though, so I'm not sure who the Marxists that aren't talking about class politics are, but I suppose they're out there.
Hi, Jason. Thanks very much for your talk. Roberto Cantoni, Autonomous University of Barcelona. Just one question about so you mentioned the fact that environmental doomism is kind of a right-wing discourse. So I was wondering, how do you explain the fact that it is used as a narrative weapon by anti-systemic ecological movements such as Extinction Rebellion that you also mentioned as a kind of communication strategy? And do you think they would be detrimental to the agenda of this movement, or could it be beneficial just to raise attention from people that haven't paid attention until now? Thanks.
Such an important question. I'll try to be brief so that there's time for more questions. Let me try to be precise, and I think I tried to do this in my talk, but I was moving fast. So what I said is that state of emergency rhetoric is a right-wing discourse, and that environmental movements have used it. So I think that that's an important point. This has been a staple of mainstream environmentalist thinking, and over the past 2 decades of eco-socialist thinking as well. The world is ending, and this has been the case for over 50 years. So we want to look at its effectiveness. I read a piece in The Conversation that said, well, the Anthropocene is problematic, but at least it raises awareness. Well, so does the latest electrical vehicle. Raises awareness is not enough. Raises consciousness in a way that directly challenges the ideological and political power and economic power of the 1% is a very different thing. And so this is why I have even profound differences with degrowth as a slogan, independent of the great work that folks are doing under that sign, is the growth is not the problem. And the challenging growth is not necessarily a challenge to the 1%, which has been looking for a transition out of capitalism for about 50 years. And I think now what we're seeing is the too big to fail dynamic growing by leaps and bounds. In more or less explicit ways, you see the dominant Euro-American powers looking for a kind of post-capitalist, too big to fail strategy of political accumulation to replace whatever we have now, which is clearly in a deep and irreversible stagnation.
Thank you. Before I come to you, if I could just go with the question online. I wasn't sure if it was a rhetorical question or not, but I think Janet has sort of clarified it. Jason, I'm not sure if you can read it. It says, Marx said that capitalism is a system of human creation that is beyond human control. Capitalists themselves are unable to break out of the inexorable logic of capitalism. He foretold imagined revolution would destroy capitalism. But is there a third possibility, given where the planet is right now, which is the breakdown of capitalist systems of finance, governance, production, under the inexorable logic of planetary change, resulting in chaotic and catastrophic breakdown of civilization?
Well, all except for the last phrase, I totally agree with, of civilization. We want to, let's free ourselves of the neo-Malthusian mantra. I'm not saying you're a neo-Malthusian, Gemma, of collapse and breakdown. If we want to use breakdown, let's use it in Grossman's precise meaning of it, which involved the class struggle for socialism as well. But I think all of the above, yes, there are profound breakdown tendencies, which are not just about the breakdown in a mechanical sense, but of the crisis of politics, of class relations, of ideology, etc. So the likely outcome of the present conjuncture is a kind of jostling for global preeminence between rough and ready formulations here, between a Belt and Road strategy and a Euro-American unipolar Great Reset strategy. And we're seeing, I mean, already, as I've argued elsewhere, we're seeing in Ukraine the outbreak of World War III. So around these questions, climate crises in the modern world have often coincided with great world wars. This was the case in the 17th century. It was the case in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So that's likely. That has profound breakdown tendencies in the way that Gemma just articulated, but it also brings forth the possibility for revolutionary transformation. So as we know, the end of great wars and even small wars over the past centuries have been moments of revolutionary possibility in action. The Soviet Revolution in 1917, the Chinese and national liberation movements across the global South after World War II. We don't need to wax romantic or utopian about that, but simply to identify that great wars are destabilizing politically. And add to that, I think, the climate crisis, which is part of the drive towards the World War III. And we have that mix, that cocktail that Gemma laid out for us of revolutionary possibility, of contradiction spiraling out of control, and capitalists trying to figure out how to engineer a post-capitalist transition in the midst of all of it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Julian Kwon, University of Greenwich. You've already partially responded to this question, but I'm struggling a little to imagine what are the alternatives, the practical alternatives to environmental techno-managerialism. What do they look like? How do we go about constructing them? Do the decolonization, anti-imperialist, feminist struggles, environmental social movements in the West contain the seeds of this? Is there more? I mean, somehow postulating planetary eco-socialism is kind of not enough. We need to know a little bit about what it looks like, how we get there. Are there any seeds of this transition in the breakdown of, let's say, globalization and the move towards a multipolar world, the BRICS countries, etc., although they are arguably state capitalism in many respects and part of the Capitalocene? But so what are the movements? What are the points for change? I mean, you talk about the possibility of revolutionary transformation, but how does this arise? Where and when? Where are the seeds of it? What do we build on to start this transition?
The question is entirely correct, that we need to look at the actual history of revolutionary movements and of socialist projects of reconstruction. Here's the first thing I want to say about any meaningful attempt to challenge the world's 1%, and it's capture. The reality is captured in that famous phrase from the Tet Offensive, and there have been many others before, similar phrases before that. In order to save the village, it became necessary to destroy it. And the example of Vietnam and the national liberation struggle there is quite salient. That the problem from the point of view of the United States was not that the Vietnamese or other third world liberation movements were described themselves as socialist or communist, but that they would threaten to consume some share of the cheap natures in a relatively more egalitarian way than the United States wanted, that they would essentially gobble up the cheap labor, food, energy, and resources of the world that allowed, first of all, world accumulation to proceed, and second of all, the United States after World War II to control its European and East Asian allies, especially, but not only through cheap oil. So we need to look at that history. This is going to be a frustrating answer to your brilliant question, yes, but I can't walk through all of the different elements. Are there elements in projects like agroecology that we need to bring forward into socialism? Yes, of course. But I would say, first of all, we need to stop imagining that there's going to be some peaceful kumbaya moment of the transition to an alternative and democratic future. The imperialist forces will never allow it. Let's just dwell for a moment on this factoid I spit out a few minutes ago. The United States operates special forces, basically counterinsurgency units in 3/4 of the world's countries. The United States since 1999 has indulged in the greatest era of military adventurism and foreign policy ever in the history of humankind. Over 1/3 of some 500 foreign military interventions. And this is without a significant, meaningful sort of revolutionary threat anywhere in the world. So what I would say in that light, and because I have limited time, is that we need to go back and look at the history of state socialisms and see what they did very well. The anti-communist ideology tells us it was all bad, they were just as bad, all this stuff. It's empirically dubious in most cases. And the experience of state socialisms, especially in a world where the climate, class, geopolitical conjuncture is likely to impose even more devastation on the planet, the experience of state socialism in Reconstruction is quite extraordinary. And that doesn't mean we can't be critical. We should, we need to be in all of that. But we don't need to apologize for looking at those experiences. I think the experiences of socialist and communist internationalism, of non-aligned movements, of talk of New Bandung and all that, that yes, it's messy as you point out. And China certainly is a capitalist country, and none of the state socialist countries were ever outside of capitalism either, by the way. So that's instructive as we confront the challenges today. There's not going to be some warm and fuzzy decommodification, socialization of fossil fuels. This is the picture that we get from Naomi Klein, who's brilliant. I love her book, okay? So I'm not bagging on Naomi Klein just because I'm some cranky socialist, but she's completely forgotten the lessons of the shock doctrine book she wrote before. That basically, pretending like that there can be popular movements to decarbonize the world through the socialization of fossil fuel assets is going to be met with all sorts of dirty tricks and counterinsurgencies and the deployment of national security states against opponents. We see this worldwide, but we see this especially in the United States. So I would say those are elements of the history that maybe we need to recuperate into the more obvious elements suggested by your question of look at various experiments of peasant, indigenous, feminist movements. Environmentalist movements are generally not movements. Environmental justice, yes, but in the long history of environmentalism, they've looked fairly small.
Thank you. Mike.
Hi, Jason. Thanks very much. Mike Goodman from University of Reading. So I think you've already given the answer to my question, but it's a very simple one. What's the problem with Greta Thunberg? Why the critique of her? I mean, from what I've seen is she's one of the most effective people to hold power to account and organize. Maybe it's not an environmental movement as you want to see it, but she's been incredibly effective to mobilize the youth, mobilize things globally. So what's your beef with Greta?
Well, first of all, I praised Greta.
You did indeed. Yes.
Yeah, and second of all, Greta is a textbook case of a Swedish environmentalist. And that's not a good thing. No more than an American environmentalist. That she embodies the imperial professional managerial class sensibilities of that kind of world outlook. Now, that means, as you rightly point out, that she is a contradictory figure, that I've traveled around the world and engaged with school, Friday strike, school, Fridays for the Future, school strike, all of that, and met some extraordinary young activists, yes, who have no clue. And no thanks to, I mean, the Thunberg is completely silent on the dominant structures of climate, capital, and empire. And you can look at her new book. So if you want to know what my beef is, let's look at her book. It raises awareness in a way that totally lets capitalism off the hook. She has a nice little thing, consumer capitalism. Consumer capitalism is what you say when you don't really want to challenge capitalism, but feel somehow that you have to do it. And so raises awareness, yes, raises awareness in a thoroughly conventional way. And in also, let me add, the most passive aggressive way possible. So this is not a radical break with anything. This fits very much in line with mainstream environmentalism from the very beginning. And that doesn't mean that I don't admire a certain moxie and courage and all of this. Of course, she's also a warmonger. So we'll just drop that out there too.
Thank you. Mike doesn't agree, but we move on.
That's okay. We can agree on some things and disagree on others. It's totally allowed.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. I find lots of fascinating ideas from your presentation, but if I hear you correctly, you said, my name is Iyo Balcha, by the way, from University of Bristol. You said academia as usual is no longer acceptable as business and politics as usual. So I want you to expand on this and comment more. In my understanding, at the moment, we have the dominance of scientific academic studies, which is essentially Eurocentric, and we have international research collaborations, particularly for scientific publications in the global south as a dominant ways of producing academic outputs, where also academic research, especially development studies, is attached to donor funding and development aid. So whenever right-wing political parties in government, so academic or scientific studies will face the funding. So I wonder to what extent there is also, like, all of us here in this room are willing to forego the privilege, the power and access to resources that we have so that the usual can be challenged, and whether the availability of potential resource, enabling policy, initial legal framework so that non-Eurocentric epistemic orientation can be at the center of coming up with new ideas of addressing this existential crisis. So when you say academic as usual is no longer acceptable, can you suggest a couple of ideas where the practicality, give some practical ideas with that regard? Thank you.
Well, you stated the matter perfectly. Of course, I know dissidents in development studies have been extraordinarily successful in waging this counter-hegemonic struggle for the past, 50, 60 and more years. So I've always drawn extraordinary inspiration and learned so much from all of my comrades in a critical agrarian and development studies. You're right, the struggle against Eurocentrism is crucial. The struggle against Eurocentrism has to be joined to the critique of anti-imperialist Marxism. Otherwise, you get bourgeois nationalism, which is what I fear a lot of decolonial thought has become. Not all. I mean, this is a contradictory mix. You get Mignolo instead of Quijano. And we can draw out other examples, of course. That's just at the tip of my tongue. So we need to do what I think many of us are doing. We need to be aware that the universities are indeed knowledge factories. I know you in the UK, many places have been engaged in protracted labor disputes. In the United States, the class and corporate character of the university is now coming into question with the greatest strike wave of academic workers in American history. There is and I point that out because I think it signals an important break with neoliberal and liberal hegemony in the universities, which tells us all to go and be good, well-behaved intellectuals. I often think of Martin Luther King, who, after he came out against the war in a very radical and synthetic way in the Beyond Vietnam speech, he said, you know, I refuse to segregate my moral concerns at a lunch counter, and I won't do it with the war in Vietnam, which was always for him a wider moment of American imperialism linked to racism at home and class exploitation on a world scale. And so I think what we need to begin to do is what we're already doing, which is to raise the critique of the university as a knowledge factory and go back to look at how the New Left in the 1960s organized the critique of the academic, of the military industrial academic complex, and to look at these, as you were in your question, you identified a development industrial academic project, a climate industrial academic project, to understand how the universities have become a key mechanism of silencing and disciplining intellectuals. What do we do practically? We need to do what you're doing now, build liberated spaces within the knowledge factory, and to do the best that we can from that standpoint, because to pretend that we live in this sort of ivory tower, of course, is completely unacceptable.
Thank you, Jason. We have 7 or 8 minutes. There are 3 people who wish to ask questions. So if you can keep your questions brief. Go on.
Sure, yeah. Ian Russell from the University of Edinburgh. Building on what you were talking about in terms of the interlinkages between good science and kind of development ideologies, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about engaging or disengaging with global epistemic infrastructures. I'm thinking particularly in the context that we're talking about with the Sustainable Development Goals and the sort of large data bank that comes with that for the purposes of global governance, and maybe a little bit about the dangers of also disengaging from those spaces and kind of giving up those epistemic infrastructures. Thank you.
So Jason,
well, it has to be both and, right? That I'm not saying don't do scholarship. We need scholarship. We need radical scholarship, and that involves contradictory relations, of course. There's no, you know, purity is as much a bourgeois illusion as sort of just the liberal practicality and just going along to getting along. So I think that it's very, very tricky, right? Because jobs, promotions, disciplines, they all exist to discipline us and to make sure that we don't stray too far off the acceptable path. Right, so if you give a political recommendation that's acceptable, that's like, oh, good policy advice. But if you give a political recommendation that requires the, you know, converting the banking system into a public utility, that's unreasonable, it's unrealistic, it's all the rest. So, I mean, dialectics involves living with the mess. So I think the best thing that we can do is to orient towards real social struggles and to naming the system and elaborating an alternative to the tyranny of man and nature and bourgeois naturalism, which is sort of coming into the academy almost on steroids in some way. I was totally naive. I thought the climate crisis would open up space for creative thinking in the academy. And instead, we've seen exactly the opposite. And I'm sure many of you can resonate in your own field. So there's been a closing down and an intensification of the disciplinary boundaries and the disciplining mechanisms that are in play.
thank you, Sam.
Hi, thanks, Jason. Great talk. Sam Hickey, DSA and GDI Manchester. It follows on from the question from a colleague in Edinburgh about the epistemic architecture linked to planetary management. But you've been really clear on where social science needs to go, I think, in terms of world ecology. But I'm not sure exactly what role you see for the natural sciences, which I think are a much more influential part of planetary management. And could you be a bit clear about this? I'm wary, in terms of creating chaos. Our next keynote speaker tomorrow morning is an environmental scientist. So I'm particularly keen to create a conversation between the two.
It's a fundamental question, and in 60 seconds, let me try my best. You're absolutely right. The two cultures is real. It's institutionally policed, and the opportunities for genuine synthesis that would involve unthinking and rethinking method and theory across the two cultures divide is non-existent. We have We have all, like in the US, we have the National Science Foundation's program for socio-ecological synthesis, but they're not really interested in synthesis. They're interested in the synthesis of the cybernetics models, basically. I mean, updated versions of them, but they're not interested in the synthesis implied by figures like the great Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin in The Dialectical Biologist and other studies, or the movements of science for the people, which is still around. That what's necessary is not simply assembling the two cultures, but calling for a fundamental unthinking and reimagination in relation to knowledge and in relation to ideology. And that's why we get this multidisciplinary reification again and again and again. And multidisciplining just amplifies the disciplinary problem. And I think often these collaborations between scholars in the two cultures, not necessarily, and I can think of important exceptions, but often these collaborations run in a very, very conventional lowest common denominator way because of the understandable pressures. People are on the clock for jobs and promotions and funding, and to show their funders they've done something. So there's a very, and also in the natural sciences, there is an even more pronounced fight for history. They don't know the history of their own disciplines. And it's quite extraordinary.
Thank you. We'll take one last question.
Thank you very much for that very great presentation, Jason. My name is Sheila Rono. I'm from Coventry University. And my question is generally on the system of climate governance. And, you talked about climate dictatorship and the fact that these climate conferences set the tone and how, climate is discussed or approached. So my question is on the environmental movements that we have also from the global south, mirroring this kind of debates on loss and damages and, talking this language of climate governance. So how do you see this environmentalism of the rich, merging with the environmentalism of the poor concepts? And because this is usually tied with issues of social justice and capitalism that we see continuing to affect or rather shape the kind of issues that people in the global south have. In terms of how land was managed and owned and the capitalist system that has continued to alienate indigenous people and the fact that they continue to face a lot of degradation as a result of all these multinational corporations, for example. Thank you.
Well, you stated the problem perfectly. And I think implied in there is the role of the big environmental NGOs, development NGOs, basically this NGO civil society network that is financed by the imperialist countries and the billionaire foundations that have exerted an absolutely corrosive and destructive role across the global south. It's a form of soft power cultural counterinsurgency. And when that fails, of course, hard power counterinsurgency comes into play, and they often work hand in glove. So that's what I would foreground. You mentioned the environmentalism of the poor, which I think is, it doesn't really tell us much. Like many of Martinez-Allier's concepts after that first great book on ecological economics, it's one of these nice sounding phrases that actually has little to do with a more specific and fine-tuned sensibility of environmental justice struggles. So, and you have outlined those struggles perfectly. The hard work of building internationalism between peasant and proletarian environmental justice struggles in the South and movements, working class movements in the North remains to be done. And the big environmental NGOs are crucial in trying to prevent those relations. Let me just give an example. Johan Rockström of Planetary Boundaries fame is what's called the chief scientist of Conservation International. Conservation International is a well-known greenwasher for outfits like Shell and Monsanto. The Ecologist magazine did an undercover kind of sting reporting where they masqueraded as an arms manufacturer who wanted greenwashing, and Conservation International was, oh yes, that's great. So these are the kinds of people and institutional forces that we're wrestling with. And part of what we need to do is to lay bare the really the imperial character of the civil society project advanced by the billionaire foundations in the North across the neoliberal era in order to make sense of the recommoning and environmental justice struggles that you rightly point out, and then to look for ways to build those internationalist alliances.
Thank you. We won't take any more questions. We are at the end of our allotted time. Thank you very much, Jason. We have a barbecue tonight, and I'm sure all of us will be talking about what you have made us think about.
Thank you, everyone. Amazing questions, everyone. And we can disagree. That's okay. That's what we need to be doing. Too often in the academy, we have this excessive politeness, but we're at a moment of climate crisis. We all recognize, let's disagree and still keep talking. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. You want me to get it? Yeah. Okay.